Welcome back to Bring It Home, your show about American reindustrialization, the manufacturing renaissance. I'm your host, JP Hampstead. We've got a great show lined up for you. Talking to Emmet Penney a little bit later about nuclear power and the policy changes, the technology changes, the social and cultural changes that need to happen to truly unlock this amazing source of power for our country and what the next steps are for that. But first, before we go to our guests, we're going to have a few headline discussions, as always. Some really big manufacturing announcements to talk about today. Kind of a low-key big day for Louisville, Kentucky, as you'll see. But first, GE Appliances has announced a new $3 billion investment into U.S. manufacturing. Really starts at their global headquarters in Louisville with a cornerstone $490 million investment into their appliance park there. That will create 800 jobs to overhaul and redesign their front-loading washer production lines. Really cool there. They're plowing money into several other manufacturing sites that Louisville's going to kick it off there. In addition, Apple announced an additional $100 billion investment into the U.S. Recall that they had already committed half a trillion, or 500 billion over the next 4 years. This 100 billion comes on top of that for a total of 600 billion. Over the next 4 years, Apple plans to hire directly about 20,000 people in the United States, all as part of its American manufacturing program. Its big project to insource as much production and components and raw materials into the U.S. as possible, to the point where where Americans are no longer using iPhones and Apple products made in other countries, but ones that are made right here. And in fact, we're going to make so much Apple stuff in the U.S. that we're actually going to be exporting it to other countries. Though it's a really cool program. I encourage watchers of the show to really dig into it. It kind of shows how these massive corporations can grow their manufacturing and re-engineer their supply chains at scale. And it involves lots of partnerships across a whole ecosystem of suppliers. So Apple will be building stuff at 79 different U.S. factories, partnering with companies like Corning. You probably know about Corning Glass, and their huge plant in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. That's getting a massive expansion. But also Texas Instruments, TSMC, Global Wafers, really cool stuff that Apple's doing. And it seems like they're just continuing to accelerate this pretty big transformative shift for them. And finally, we have Ford announcing that they're going to invest $5 billion in electric vehicle production. Really, they said they're securing/creating 4,000 jobs in Louisville and also at Blue Oval Battery Park in Michigan. This is all about this building out this sort of what they call the Ford Universal EV platform, which is intended to simplify their vehicles. It reduces the number of parts used by 20%. It reduces the amount of wiring and the harnesses and all different sorts of things like that. And the end goal, of course, that they've announced for this investment is to create a mid-sized four-door electric pickup truck that's as fast as their EcoBoost Mustang, more cargo, more frunk space than a RAV4, all for about $30,000. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. The other thing I really want to tell you guys about is the Future of Freight Festival in Chattanooga, Tennessee, happening from October 21st to October 22nd. Again, right here in Chattanooga. It's a really cool event. There's lots of rapid fire technology demos. So if you're involved in transportation and logistics or technology or venture capital or anything like that, you want to check it out because there's lots of really cool early stage companies that are doing like 7-minute demos of their products. It all has to be live, no PowerPoints, no vaporware. Lots of sessions about different issues affecting the industry, but both like sort of future looking, but also kind of market updates and things like that. Really great entertainment, special VIP experiences across the city, live music, things like that. I wanted to call out 3 of the keynotes that have been announced. Leland Miller, the CEO of China Beige Book, which is a really cool platform that uses alternative data to kind of drill down into the real economic activity happening in China and kind of get you past the sometimes implausible numbers put out by the Chinese Communist Party. He's a probably one of the most famous China watchers in the world. He'll be there telling us about what's going on across the Pacific Ocean. We have Jack Kennedy, the CEO and co-founder of Platform Science, the great telematics and fleet management company, talking about what they're doing. Likely, we'll be hearing about AI and how Platform Science is incorporating that into their product line. And then Patrick Fuchs, an alumni of this show, actually. He's the chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, which is really a really powerful federal government body that kind of oversees the economic regulation of the railroads. So making sure that the rates are fair, that the service is good, approving mergers. That's really big in the news right now because of Union Pacific's interest in acquiring Norfolk Southern. So he'll be the guy who signs off or doesn't sign off on that. Really, a lot of really interesting content at that conference. Definitely encourage you to check it out. And if you do want to go to the Future of Freight Festival, we have a promo code. If you register for the event and you use the promo code BIHF325, you can get $900 off on your ticket. So be sure to use that promo code when you buy your tickets. Get the deal. Come to Chattanooga. Let's hang out. All right. That's all I've got for the headlines. Let's get to our guests. Welcome back to Bring It Home. With us today is our guest, Emmet Penney. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation. He's an energy writer and historian, advocate of nuclear power. Emmet, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here.
It's been really cool. I just wanted to say, kind of first off, you can find Emmet on Twitter, on Substack. His Substack is called Nuclear Barbarians. He writes about a lot of different topics, from sort of like current policy debates to the history of the electrical grid, economic and market dynamics that affect utilities and power regulation. So it's been really cool to kind of get to know your work recently. And again, thanks for being on the show, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Maybe to start off, Emmet, I just want to hear from you. I want to hear you describe like the state of the electrical grid in the United States of America. What's good about it, what's bad about it, and just sort of what are the dynamics of supply and demand right now?
Totally. So I think one thing that we can say at the top of the list is that the U.S. power grid is, at this point, though China may outpace us here, the largest continuous machine in the world, right? So it stretches the coasts. It has 3 different major regions: the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and then there's Texas right there. And it is broken up into a variety of different entities. So some of those are traditional vertically integrated monopoly utilities, which are overseen by state regulators. And then some of them are more like spot markets. And those are regionally broken up into a few different things. And some of those spot markets are contained to just specific states. So examples would be California, Texas, and New York. Others are more regional. So I live in Illinois, which is split into 2 different power markets. One is called PJM, which is the largest power market in the country. It's 13 states plus Washington, D.C. And then the southern half of the state belongs to the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, right? So that spans from about Minnesota all the way to Louisiana. So one thing that we can say about the grid is that it has served us incredibly well as a nation. It is the foundation of our industrial wealth. It powers everything we do. It is the mother network of our society. And for the last few years, the grid has been running into some serious trouble. There has been a glut of retirements, so that especially in the coal sector. Some of that is because natural gas outcompeted it in these markets, and some of that has to do with political pressure. We've also seen some gas retirements. Some of that's just natural, and some of that is also political. And at the same time, we've seen a huge ramp up in wind and solar, which are not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but are not capable of running a power grid on their own. So when we have a decrease in dispatchable, reliable power and an increase in intermittent sources, people start to look to their neighbors, hoping that they still have some sort of coal or nuclear plant running that they can import from. The problem is, if their neighbors are pursuing the same sort of green political paradigm as the people who want to import is, then there starts to become less and less power available. Now, this was scary, but was a more slow-moving crisis in the background until the AI boom. And that changed everything, because all of the power markets that I've just described tend to be the places where these things are playing out. And by these things, I mean this sort of dynamic of overcommitment to renewables, over-reliance on just-in-time natural gas, and over-dependence on neighbors for imports. And none of these power markets have ever seen a substantial uptick in power demand. They are relatively new entities that started to get formed in the 90s, and then especially in the early 2000s is when they sort of got more institutional firmness around them for what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to operate. So now everybody is starting to realize that the music for the game of musical chairs is about to end, and no one wants to be caught without a seat. So we're starting to see a few different things happen now. We're starting to see people say, you know what, maybe we need to keep these coal plants online somehow. Certainly we've seen that at the federal level with Trump. And some people are starting to say, we could really speed solar deployments with batteries, because the cost curve has come down so much on solar, and we're seeing a lot of it, and batteries can help firm that up. We've seen some of that in California. Though I want to be clear, sort of what's happening in California isn't necessarily that the batteries are stored with solar power. They are often stored with gas power. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it has actually helped stabilize the California grid. It's just good to be a little bit more clear on what's doing what when we're talking about the grid. And now we're starting to see this push for more nuclear, especially because the queues for new gas turbines, for new gas plants, is stretching into the early 2030s at this point. And I don't think we're really going to see places like GE Vernova super scale up its turbine division to make sure that it meets every single piece of demand. I mean, they like the price point right now. And also, that's a lot of physical capital to invest in. And if you call it wrong, and maybe the AI boom isn't quite as big as people think, you're stuck with all of that invested capital. So it's better to play it a little bit safe, let the order book get longer, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, we're in this problem-solving terrain, both at the federal, regional, and state level. So like my state, Illinois, is about to run into a ton of issues because it has decided it wants to shut down almost all of its fossil fuel infrastructure in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, it is also illegal to build new nuclear here larger than 300 megawatts, right? So the standard nuclear plant is 1,000 megawatts these days. And people say, well, what about SMRs? But no SMR company wants to invest in a space where there's a cap on the capacity your nuclear plant could be, because it sends a signal to them that nuclear isn't a place you can trust. So I don't know how Illinois is going to solve that problem. It's going to be really, really tough. But clearly, some other states are already starting to resolve those issues. So Governor Healy in Massachusetts is looking at repealing Massachusetts' new nuclear moratorium. We're even, I think, hearing whispers of that in New Jersey and some other places. And then Governor Kathy Hochul over in New York has decided to commit New York's public power entity to building new nuclear after they closed down prematurely their Indian Point nuclear power plant a few years ago, which made the state way more reliant on natural gas. That power plant powered a ton of New York City and was a huge loss for the state. So we're starting to see a learning curve. We're starting to see some adaptation, and we're seeing a lot of institutional learning at the power market level for how to deal with power demand for the first time. How do you connect all of this new stuff coming onto the grid in a timely manner? How do you, because these power markets don't determine policy, signal responsibly to lawmakers without putting your thumb on the scale what is and isn't working within your power system? So there's a lot of difficult, very complicated stuff happening here. But this is a crucial piece of technology that we rely on for everything.
The pitch for like nuclear energy as opposed to other forms like more coal or gas plants or things like that is just that it's a form of energy that can actually produce enough power that like a nuclear power plant generates so much power in a sort of reliable, dispatchable way that it makes it, that coupled with like a lack of sort of like pollution and emissions and things like that, it makes it the best source of power. Is that your view? Am I missing anything there?
Yeah, that's pretty close. So we could say a few things. So nuclear is the only power source that takes full responsibility for its waste, which is stored in enormous concrete casts, which just sit on site, not bothering anybody. Coal stores a lot of its waste in the air, as does natural gas. There is no real recycling industry for renewables. It's just not cost effective. So a lot of that stuff
it's all
sits
just
in
like buried in landfills.
Yeah, exactly. So we can say that on that level, it's good. It's super energy dense, which means you get the most amount of power per like acre or square foot, right? So, you can just take a look at, if you go on Google Maps, the size of like any nuclear power plant, and then compare that to, comparable capacity, though it's not the same because it's not reliable, for like wind and solar or something like that, or even natural gas. And then I would say nuclear has a really high capacity factor, which means, let's say you have 1,000 megawatt, which is 1 gigawatt, so a 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant. How often are you going to get a full gigawatt of power? For nuclear, that's above 90% of the time.
Right.
For solar, the national average is like 24, 25%, something like that. And that's very regional dependent, right? So we're talking about something super, super reliable, super power dense. And I would also say that it creates a ton of jobs and an incredible tax base for the communities that live there, that live near the plant. The farther away from a nuclear plant, the more you'll meet people that might not like nuclear. The closer you live to a plant, the more you find people who really love it. So that tends to be the dynamic.
Yeah, and with regard to capacity and power density and things like that, quantity has a quality all of its own, right? Things happen to societies when power is abundant and cheap, and there's like it's not a question of like, oh, are we having like brownouts, or is like the spot market like spiking our electricity rates, but it's like, oh, like there's plenty of megawattage to do whatever we want, including powering AI. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of like the recent writing you've done. Actually, if we can sort of go back in time to the beginning of America's electrical grid. You've been writing on Substack about Samuel Insull, who is like a sort of a collaborator and colleague of Thomas Edison, went on to sort of mastermind his own strategy for utilities in Chicago. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the background of Samuel Insull and his work?
Sure.
And then we can go into some of the recent writing you've done. Actually, if we can sort of go back in time to the beginning of America's electrical grid. You've been writing on Substack about Samuel Insull, who is like a sort of a collaborator and colleague of Thomas Edison, went on to sort of mastermind his own strategy for utilities in Chicago. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Can you tell us a little bit about how the initial construction of the grid played out and what that can teach us about, perhaps the transition to nuclear that's kind of before us now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we talk about sort of the early days of electricity, there are a few names that tend to stand out. So George Westinghouse is one of them, Nikola Tesla, and then of course Thomas Edison. And all of these guys had a very important role to play. So Edison makes light more affordable with his incandescent bulb and his DC system. So that's direct current. And the way that worked was you had a power plant that was a central station. So before it used to be like one power plant per building, which was really, really pricey. Only like luxury hotels and stuff could afford that because gas and other forms of domestic power were just way cheaper. So Edison realized that if you had the direct current central station, you could use one power station to power a bunch of different things. Right. So street lamps, buildings, stuff like that, all at the same time. The problem was the DC system, direct current, as the lines got longer, it got weaker and weaker and weaker as a current, which meant that he was very geographically constrained. You'd have to outlay a ton of capital to build a bunch of different power stations to serve stuff that is relatively close to each other. I think the farthest out you could do was probably a mile. And then it was really hard to manage that system. So it's expensive, hard to manage. If only there was a way to send power farther, more powerfully, so that you could pack more people into the area around a bigger power plant. In other words, achieve bigger economies of scale. And that's what George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla figure out with alternating current, is that you can step up into alternating current, rocket it down. Well, it doesn't really get sent, but for the sake of the conversation, it gets sent down the power line, and then step it back down to DC so that it feeds whatever you're doing. That's pretty close to the exact system we have today. And so they were early innovators of that. And Edison hated that for all sorts of reasons. One, because he was very, very stubborn. And he really tried to defeat alternating current, but the raw physics and economics just eventually unseated him. And he had a protege named Samuel Insull, who was a British immigrant, a young man who'd risen through the ranks in Edison's businesses, and had a gift for management and sales. And he was even an adept at understanding the technical aspects of this. And he never harbored resentment against George Westinghouse or Tesla or any of those guys. In fact, had good relationships with them and thought Edison had been very silly. So Insull, once Edison's empire crumbles, decides to helm Chicago Edison, which was one of Edison's old Midwestern utilities. And Chicago is on the rise, but still kind of a backwater. And Insull makes this bet. He says, I don't think that it's going to be like General Electric. I think it is. So in other words, I'm not going to make my money building pieces of power infrastructure. I'm going to make money because there's going to be more money in selling power itself, right? That's what he bet. So he wants to be in the utility industry. And so he takes the leadership position at Chicago Edison and then completely takes over the town because he says, I'm going to embrace alternating current and I'm going to use it to create economies of scale by creating monopoly. Because if we have this theory where one plant serving the most amount of people is the most efficient way to do things, then competition just gets in the way of that. So he outflanks everybody in the Chicago area, buys them all up, locks in monopoly there, which stabilizes investment, because before people were doing rate wars and just sending each other into bankruptcy, and it was really hard for the power industry to actually get off, and there were redundant power lines and all this other stuff. So he says, I'm going to clean all that up, and then I'm going to turn that into a formal structure where a state utility commission looks over the utility within a state and regulates them. And in exchange, we get rid of things like...
This is just a side note, but what you're saying about the rate wars between early utilities almost reminds me of the railroad industry in the 19th century with just massive overbuilding of infrastructure due to unnecessary competition. You had transcontinentals cutting across Kansas within 30 or 40 miles of each other. with very little traffic to even like compete for it, right? And then you had tons of bankruptcies, tons of consolidation, and now, of course, you may have seen the news. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are trying to merge to create the first like coast-to-coast U.S. rail, and it's very it's kind of interesting to hear from like now that like the typical railroad customer is a very large multinational corporation. They actually don't want to have to move their transfer their goods between like multiple railroads multiple times just to get them from point A to point B, and they prefer working with an integrated network. So anyway, it's interesting how other industries have gone through that same sort of like just very capital destructive competition cycle, only to come through the other side and realize that, oh wait, no, actually, like economies of scale mean that like maybe a natural monopoly like was the way to go all along.
Absolutely. At least it was at the time. Where this is an era where electricity is a cutting edge technology, and no one knows how to invest in it or what it means. It's to think about it as like a Silicon Valley startup almost. People are like, "What is this? This is foreign." There were other ways to light cities, light homes, and stuff like that.
Right. Like that. No one's going to need. Only 10,000 people are going to need electricity, or things like that.
Yeah, people had really low estimate for the amount of onboarding that was going to happen with the electricity system. It was only men like Insull that said, I can really drive costs down to get everyday people to consume this. This is not a luxury good. This should be a ubiquitous good. And the impacts on society were huge. So I'll just skip to this part and then pivot to the nuclear. So what he figures out is that once he has the guaranteed rate of return, no competition for monopoly status, and a stabilized the investment climate, he can really grow this system. And he develops what's called the build and grow system, which becomes the template for utility investment up until about the 1970s, right? So he pulls this off in the early part of the century. It's a very long time. And the way it works is, okay, so I am going to build, I'm going to use the money I have to build an enormous power plant. I'm going to justify that to the regulator. They're going to give me a guaranteed rate of return for that. And that power plant is going to be enormous. It's going to be so big that it will decrease the price of power, which will increase both consumption and the customer base, which will then increase the amount of money I have to do that all over again, right? So that's what they were doing. So you watched power systems generation per unit grow and grow and grow as the price went down and the customer base widened and consumption of electricity became very, very common in society. That was the world that was still taking place after World War II. That is perhaps the biggest boom in power consumption that there ever was, because it was about, on average, between 5 and 7% annual demand growth for the power sector for like 2.5 decades. It's pretty unreal to think about that today and what that means. So that meant that you could really justify building bigger and bigger and more experimental power plants because, it was almost free to do so. You could just rate base that, they call it. It's just, okay, we're going to pay that off very, very quickly because demand is just skyrocketing really, really reliably. And we need bigger and bigger plants to serve it anyway. So we're just going to build and grow our way through this. A few things happened in the 70s. Part of it was the oil shock. Part of it was stagflation. But it just reamed the industry, and we saw power demand plummet. And so suddenly people had invested in all of this nuclear technology, and it was seeing delays because they had grown it too fast, too theoretically, even though there's all very reliable plants, most of which are still with us today. And that just killed the industry, destroyed the investment case for nuclear. Part of the reason that we're seeing people talk about nuclear again today is because now we are back in an atmosphere of perhaps consistent runaway power demand growth. And what do we have that is the most energy dense and reliable available to deploy? And that is not to besmirch other power generators. We're going to have portfolios of all different kinds, right? If you're in a Western state like Wyoming, your wind fleet, pretty robust. I think that's like 40% of their power almost. That's pretty intense. Illinois can't do that. The conditions aren't right, So what are we going to do? And nuclear seems to be part of that solution. And that's why, if you'll notice, that whole conversation was really about how do you finance these things? What's the business case for it? And that's the question we're answering today. How do we finance nuclear? How do we make this possible? Because our learning curve with nuclear has been really, really painful. The way you want to do nuclear, and there's a new paper out from Nature that looks at how China's doing it, is which seems correct based on other research I've done, is that you more or less sort of pick one design and get really good at just stamping it out. One of the reasons that we saw runaway costs with nuclear in the 60s and 70s is that we had a bunch of different types of designs. So nobody was really building institutional knowledge on how to deploy these things. Everything was a little bit bespoke. We had a bunch of different vendors. And so now the question is, who's going to be first past the post for deploying these things and sort of become our national champions? And that'll happen in a few different categories. So you'll have traditional gigawatt scale large reactors. You'll have small modular reactors, which are less than that, 500 or below. There's a huge debate over what counts as an SMR. We'll just say 500 and below for now. And then micro reactors, which are going to have niche, like forward operating based deployments and stuff like that. Whatever companies can really step up and start delivering, and some are in a better position to do that, I think are going to be the ones that basically get de facto standardized, because they're just going to reduce risk entirely. That's my opinion. Other people think that what we're really going to see is that a competition is actually going to drive down costs and create the cheap nuclear we want, because we just have a better handle on the technology overall altogether these days compared to the 50s, 60s, and 70s when it was brand spanking new. So, maybe. We're about to find out who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, it seems like the more reactors any one company builds, the more economical it will be. And to me, if I was understanding correctly, that's sort of part of the business case for SMRs, is that like one factory or production facility could make many small reactors that could then be like shipped off and like sort of finally assembled like in place or whatever. But instead of like building again like sort of like custom one-off designs like in situ, and then going through that whole learning curve and R&D spend every time, sort of standardizing it and producing them at mass scale. But do you have an opinion about sort of the role that SMRs might play, or do you think
I think it's going to be all about market fit, to be honest. I don't think we're going to see any one of these things just like be the technology, right? So just to break it down for your audience, the modularity idea is, as you were just saying, you can build these things almost like Lego pieces, drive them out to the site, snap them together there, and that reduces a lot of your time, as you said, in situ, being there and building it. Modularity is the most challenging part of SMRs. To be clear, very technically difficult to pull off. That doesn't mean impossible. That doesn't mean no one's going to do it. It just means that their major selling point is their most challenging obstacle to deployment when it comes time to getting steel in the ground. So that's important to keep in mind. I would also say that the most recent large reactors that we have at Vogtle, units 3 and 4, those were modular, and those do qualify as advanced reactors. So really, the competition is going to be between large modular and small modular, and then where they fit in the market, right? So I used to live in New Mexico. I cannot imagine a world in which Santa Fe, New Mexico is going to need a bunch of gigawatt scale nuclear reactors. It's a city of like 100,000 people. That's just not going to happen. It's never going to become a manufacturing hub. That's just not what that place does. Could it benefit from low carbon, ultra reliable SMR power? Totally. Especially because some SMR designs use way less water than our larger ones. So perfect for high desert deployment like that, So again, it's going to be all about market fit. If you're on the Eastern Seaboard or in the Midwest, you have a lot of river access and things like that. You have a lot of heavy manufacturing. You have a lot of data centers that are being deployed around there because you have a lot of grid connections and stuff like that. You might want the larger plants out there,
So, I have to say I was a little like puzzled. when I started seeing all of the buzz about small modular reactors, because I was, my dad was in the Navy. My brother-in-law was a Navy nuke on an aircraft carrier, and I was always under the impression that like we have like hundreds or at least dozens of small modular nuclear reactors already operating all the time. So can you explain sort of like if what we learned from what the U.S. Navy has done, and then why like these small modular reactors, these advanced reactors that they're talking about building now, are different or an improvement, or how are they differentiated?
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about that. And again, some of the nuclear engineers will know this way better than I would. You can check out my colleague Nick Turan on Twitter at What Is Nuclear, or my friend Mark Nelson at Energy Bants. They'll have great breakdowns for this. If people are looking for other information out there, they're great sources for that. But I can give the broad strokes, which so what did we learn from the naval experience with nuclear? Both Navy nuclear and our civilian nuclear fleet were created by the same guy, and that is Admiral Hyman Rickover. And Admiral Hyman Rickover created the propulsion reactors for the naval fleet. It is an amazing story that I'm currently writing about now, so hopefully I'll be able to share a long piece on this with your audience in a similar fashion to what I'm doing with the Insole piece. And then the aircraft nuclear program got canceled for a little bit in the 50s because the Eisenhower administration was trying to balance the federal budget back when we did that. And so as a consolation prize, Rickover receives the contract to build the first civilian nuclear reactor in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. And he begins that project in 1955 and finishes 2 years later and creates other subsidiary industries like for zirconium and stuff like that.
Craziest part of that story was 2 years later.
Yeah. 2 years later.
Yeah, keep going though.
Yeah, I know. Wild, right? Amazing what you can do when you don't have to deal with NEPA review. And Rickover was a hard driving manager, very difficult person, probably a great man of history, like one of the great idiosyncratic managers out there. I would say that he has a leadership style that is probably more aggressive, but similar to Jensen Huang over at NVIDIA. So super flat, very meritocratic, exacting, super demanding, will dress you down in front of other people, things like that. So Rickover pulls that off, but he bets on the same technology for propulsion, which is pressurized water as the reactor pool, and he does that for a few reasons. One, from a safety perspective, it's just easier. If you have things like molten salt, stuff like that, some of these more lead bismuth, some of these more boutique reactor coolants and things, keep the reactor from overheating, et cetera, et cetera. You get all sorts of operational challenges. Now, those operational challenges aren't necessarily bad or impossible to overcome. However, he wanted to deploy what was going to be sort of the easiest to maintain over time. So he made a bet. He said, this thing's going to have a heavy capital outlay out front, but it's going to last forever and have really easy safety protocols. And that's what we're aiming for, so it'll amortize over time and keep serving. And nuclear could be, these light water reactors that make up most of the global fleet. That's how influential Rickover's decision was. It is most of the nuclear that exists in the world, is that they can last for probably over a century. So we're talking multi-generational power infrastructure here, and perhaps even longer than that. I mean, we're still kind of in the opening days here. Now, there are competing narratives, which Rickover was very cognizant of and wrote about and debated with other technical experts at the national labs. And it was, what if we use some of these other things and they were more efficient or, could be deployed faster? You could build smaller ones. What would that look like? And Rickover thought that was just a lot of professional engineers basically stroking their own egos who weren't serious about deploying. Rickover was kind of an asshole. But we have a fair amount of expertise now with the test reactors of almost every single strike that is being advertised as an SMR today. So we can technically do all of this. The question is just going to be, what are the operational costs of these things in the long term? Who's going to pay for that power and what price are they comfortable with? And how long are these things going to last compared to light water technology? And we don't know. We do know that we had some problems with test reactors and stuff in the 50s, but that doesn't mean that trying them with new perspectives, new teams, new innovations, with everything we've learned about nuclear in the meantime, won't be successful. So that is some of what's going on there. Some people will say, like, okay, look, my SMR is going to have, a lower cost of deployment than a light water, but its fuel costs are going to be higher for X, Y, or Z reasons. So you're a little bit more variable.
You have, this or that, some sorts of maintenance or refueling or whatever.
Right, exactly. So the question is, what is the purchaser going to be comfortable with? Are they going to say, okay, well, I think I'm like a little more confident that I'm going to be able to pay for this design and have it deployed, and that's going to be cheaper, and I am willing to accept perhaps a higher cost of power, a more variable cost of power or something like that as a trade-off for making sure that I own the plant and that it is delivered on time. I mean, right now, a lot of the stuff is still just theoretical. Light water is what we have experience building in a commercial setting.
Yeah.
So there we go. The path dependency is there. What I will say is that for people that are doing non-light water designs in the SMR space, the regulatory regime, which is already being worked out with the admin and with Congress right now, needs to be a little bit kinder to them, because right now it is based on light water and caters to light water. And I think that is very unfair for some of these companies.
That's interesting. That kind of brings us to maybe the last thing I wanted to ask you about, Emmet, which was back in mid-July, Westinghouse announced that they were going to construct, I think, 10 additional AP1000 nuclear reactors in the United States, I believe, with construction or maybe operations beginning by 2030. I wanted to hear, it sounds cool, and like, the Trump administration loves, sort of these like headline wins and, splashy announcements of big things. Some of them are more transformative than others. I just wanted to kind of hear, your sort of like expert take on the announcement and what it really means.
So I was really happy to see Westinghouse finally being a little bit more proactive about their AP1000 design. I think that they were really licking their wounds from the Vogtle experience, where deploying those designs went really over budget and really over time, and that was painful for them. So now it seems like they sort of have grown back their cojones, and they're like, actually, we want to deploy more of these. The demand is there. The administration and Trump CEOs ask for 10 more gigawatts of gigawatt scale nuclear that we have experience building. Well, that's the AP1000. That's what we've got. Technically, GE has what's called an ABWR, Advanced Boiling Water Reactor, that is approved and they could deploy. But they don't seem to have the appetite for that right now. That might change after this Westinghouse announcement. So this Westinghouse announcement could have a few different things. It could bring more players to the table in terms of competition with them. It could crowd out the space where everybody's like, all right, they're the winner. I think the real question is how aggressive is Westinghouse going to be? Because right now their reputation isn't the best. They can be very difficult to deal with. And I would say that they're pretty arrogant. They assume that they're the only game in town, and they act like it. So the question is, how much is this them hogging the spotlight? And how are they going to be lazy and arrogant, or are they going to be really, really aggressive? And the other thing is figuring out the financing for this stuff. So they want to build 10 more. Who's going to commission those? Are they going to make use of government credit subsidies and stuff like that to get that to happen? There's a huge coordinating issue here, because Southern Company, which built the Vogtle 3 and 4, had an enormous balance sheet. So it could eat that risk, and it had a really supportive regulator in the Georgia Public Utility Commission. That is not the case for most other utilities in America. So where's the fit here? That's going to be the question.
So this
about
is like
steel
them sort of like planting their flag in the ground early on and even trying to like attract buyers.
I think that's exactly what's going on. They're saying, hey, actually, we want to deploy this. We're willing to work with the administration to do this. They're basically saying we're going to be more cooperative now. And if they hold true to that, and we see a sort of cultural change within Westinghouse, and we see them really come out of their shell and step up, I think that's great. I think that is exactly
been
what
deploying these in numbers in China, though, right? And there's some of these reactors in Eastern Europe as well.
Yeah, so that's the and there's a similar design in Korea and in the United Arab Emirates. So Westinghouse has a lot of incumbency here, and its technology is super proven. But building something in China is not the same as building it in America. I mean, there's all sorts of other stuff that they have to deal with. The CCP doesn't. I mean, can you imagine the CCP doing like several rounds of community engagement for deploying these things on one of their rivers? I can't.
No.
They're just going to do it.
Yeah.
People who want to build that Westinghouse reactor are going to have to put up with a lot of that, and a lot of that's like kayfabe and not real and not helpful, and drives costs up. It really starts to turn industrial projects into a jobs program for
where you have to like pay all of these different people off.
Basically, yeah, it's a Ponzi scheme for white collar NGO lawyers.
So now let's talk a little bit about the scale of this. Like, okay, 10 gigawatts of additional nuclear power. Is that a lot, a little? Is it a drop in the bucket? Is it a significant step forward into the scale of like the projects we need to be building? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So let's compare that with something. So, Project Stargate, the big OpenAI, NVIDIA thing that's happening down south, is 5 gigawatts. So this would be double what they're asking for. That is more than, major metropolitan areas and stuff like that. So this is a substantial amount of power, but I actually don't think it's enough on its own to meet reshoring and the AI boom. So really, really important, but in the grand scheme of things, while it could be hugely beneficial and building those 10 could finally get us to a place where we can just rep out nuclear when we need it because we have the supply chains, we have the workforce, we know exactly what things cost and when they're going to be delivered. I think that we're still going to need natural gas in the meantime. We're going to have to stop shutting down coal. And I think we're going to see more renewable energy and battery deployments. I mean, I just think that we are in a situation where the American power grid has no option but to be totally omnivorous in terms of what is going to feed it.
Fascinating. Emmet, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to meet you and talk to you. Really appreciate the advocacy you're doing on behalf of all Americans who use electricity, right?
Thank you so much. This was great.
Awesome. You can find this show at bringithome.us. We're on Twitter. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on YouTube. You can find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts. Stay tuned, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.